Fix this, and I'll marry you." The billionaire threw her hands at the $70 million prototype her best engineers had already written off. It was a joke, a cruel one, aimed at her own team, comparing 6 MIT engineers to the man mopping the corner of her lab. The engineers laughed. Dean Miller didn't. He set the mop handle against the wall, looked at the smoking machine, then at her. And he thought about the number printed on the hospital form folded in his back pocket. $50,000, cash, by noon tomorrow. "I don't need a wife," he said. "I need $50,000. The laughing stopped. Put it in writing. 11 hours later, that machine would run at 104%. And the woman who made the joke would be standing in the wreckage of her own certainty, realizing she didn't want to take it back. Before we go back to the beginning, if you want to see how this one ends, take a second and subscribe. Then we'll get on with it. 31 hours before any of that, at 10 minutes past 5 in the morning, Dean Miller was reading out loud to a sleeping 9-year-old. The pediatric cardiology wing at Seattle General smelled like cherry disinfectant laid over something older. Dean had learned that smell so well he'd stopped noticing it, which was its own kind of bad news. He sat in the cracked vinyl chair he'd slept in for 3 nights, a battered paperback on one knee, his voice low enough not to compete with the heart monitor. He was 4 pages ahead of where he was actually reading. His mind was down the hall in billing, where a woman with kind eyes had explained a payment schedule to him twice, slowly, the way you explain something to a man you've already decided isn't going to manage it. "You did it again." Dean stopped mid-sentence. Maya's eyes were open, not all the way, just enough to catch him. "Did what?" She pulled the blanket up under her chin and gave him the look her mother used to give him, which was unfair and which she knew. "You skipped the mountain." Dean closed the book on his finger. He'd skipped 11 pages because 11 pages ago, Bilbo had started down a tunnel towards something enormous and sleeping. And Dean had needed to get to the end faster than the book was willing to go. "I didn't skip it. I saved it." Maya wasn't buying that. She'd spent a third of her life in rooms like this one, and one of the things that does to a kid is make them good at hearing the shape of an adult lie. Saved it for when? For after. She thought about it. Her monitor ticked along, patient and green, marking a rhythm a surgeon upstairs had called mechanically inefficient, the most expensive phrase anyone had ever said to him. "Promise. The whole mountain. All of it. No skipping." Dean put his hand on top of her head. Her twists were 3 weeks old and coming loose at the front. A night nurse had offered twice to redo them for him, and both times he'd said thank you and no. Because her mother had taught him how at a kitchen table in Renton, and it was one of about 4 things left in his life that belonged only to him. He told her he promised. Then she went back to sleep and he sat there another 20 minutes and he did not read a single word. Out in the corridor, Dean unfolded the form in his back pocket. He'd folded and unfolded it so many times the creases had gone soft. Dr. Eric Halverson, the best pediatric thoracic surgeon on the West Coast, had 1 slot open. 6 a.m., the day after tomorrow, and the hospital required the balance cleared 18 hours before the knife, which put the deadline at noon tomorrow. Not a threat, not personal, just the shape of the machine. Miss it and the slot went to another child, and Maya went back on a list 7 months long. He opened his banking app in the elevator. $412. 19 cents. He looked at that number the way you look at a wall. 31 hours to find $50,000, and a mop cart waiting for him downtown. Rourke Aerospace occupied 50 floors of glass downtown, and Dean Miller's part of it was the basement. Custodial had its own corridor down there, the color of old teeth, smelling of bleach and floor wax and hot dryer dust. His uniform was gray. The patch above the pocket said Rourke Aerospace, Custodial Services, and under it, smaller, D. Miller. He pulled on the rubber gloves and loaded the cart. One of the front casters had a flat spot and clicked against the floor every rotation, and by now that click was the sound Dean's whole life made when it moved. Night shift started at 6. Here is what it's like to push that cart through a building full of people who make $400,000 a year. On 29, the night security supervisor asked to see his badge. Same supervisor, third time since March. Dean held it up. The man read it and nodded and went back to his monitors, and neither of them said a word about it, because there was no version of saying something that ended well. And on 31, somebody held a door for him, genuinely, politely. Then let it go half a second early because his hand had registered object and not man. Dean caught it with the cart. He said thank you anyway. He was on 44 by 7 because 44 was R&D, and R&D was on his list. 6 weeks earlier, he'd signed off the recommissioning report for the test chamber's ventilation. That part was standard. Facilities always signs the airflow certs. What wasn't standard was that he'd read the entire system schematic first on his own time, because he could not physically make himself stop. So he knew that room, where the ducts ran, where the pressure fought itself. And walking down the corridor with his cart clicking, he knew the intake fan above the lab had a bearing 4 days from failure, because he'd heard it changing for 2 weeks, and the sensors hadn't caught up. That was the thing about Dean Miller's ears. They had cost him a fortune once. The R&D lab on 44 was 2 stories of white light and blast glass, and at 7:40 in the evening it was full of people who were losing. Dean set his ladder under the ceiling intake and went up with a socket wrench. From there he could see the whole floor. 6 engineers around a bank of monitors, the woman standing apart, and behind 4 inches of blast glass, the thing itself. The X7 core sat on the test stand like a beached shark, conical, matte, taller than a man. $70 million of titanium alloy and one whole side of it scorched black. Say it again, Nolan. Slower. That was Delaney Rourke, 34, and for 2 years the chief executive of the company her father built in a garage. Charcoal suit, dark hair pulled back hard enough to hurt. She did not manage with soft skills. She managed with a scalpel, and everybody on that floor had a scar. Nolan Vogel, head of propulsion, ran a hand over his scalp and said it slower. The thermal model is sound. It's a materials problem. The alloy can't take sustained chamber pressure at that duration, and the manifold is overfeeding. Delaney let that hang exactly as long as it took to become uncomfortable. You said that Tuesday. Vogel's jaw tightened. Behind him, a junior engineer lifted her tablet a few inches, and he talked over the top of her without turning around, the way you'd raise your voice over a radio. Dean, up on the ladder, watched her lower it again. Then let me tell you what Tuesday costs. She walked the monitor bank, and every engineer she passed found something urgent on his screen. The Department of Defense expects a full-duration burn packet at 8 tomorrow morning, not a summary, not a revised timeline. Telemetry from a stable burn. She stopped at the end of the row. Harlan Stroud has had 3 board votes to remove me since March. He needs a 4th. If that packet doesn't go out tomorrow, he'll have it by Friday. And this company gets carved up and sold to Redstone Dynamics, who are bidding against us on the payload contract and would very much enjoy the discount. Nobody answered. Fear is a management tool, and she had run out of the other kind. Run it, Delaney said. Vogel protested that they weren't ready. She told him she was aware. They cleared the floor. Warning lights came up red. Dean stayed where he was, one arm hooked through the ladder because nobody had told him to move, and nobody had noticed he was there. The X7 lit. Even at low throttle, the sound went straight through the building's steel and up into the soles of Dean's boots. He felt it in his back teeth. 12 seconds, 15, 18, and then the note changed. Not louder, not higher. It went flat and hard, like something enormous humming through a closed mouth, and it held that one tone for 6 full seconds, while the vibration telemetry on the far wall went yellow, then red, then filled the entire screen. The automatic cutoff killed it at 24. Smoke, and somewhere inside the casing, metal ticking as it cooled. When any the latter, Dean Miller had gone very still. Because machines being torn apart by pressure scream higher. Pressure failures climb. They rise and shriek until something lets go. That thing had not climbed. It found one note and sat on it. Dean had heard that note before. 5 years ago, 400 meters under the Pacific, in a pressure-hull test tank in Bremerton, about 90 seconds before 11 months of his own work turned into confetti. He looked down at the 6 engineers filing back onto the floor and at Vogel already reaching for the thermal model, and he understood that every one of them was looking at the wrong thing. Dean closed the intake grate and dropped the latch. Clack! 7 heads turned up toward the ceiling at once. Dean came down the ladder without hurrying. He'd learned that too, that hurrying in a room like this one reads as apology. He collapsed the ladder and picked up his card handle. Then he stopped and looked through the blast glass at the smoking cone. It's not the manifold. Vogel laughed, a short, disbelieving bark. I'm sorry, do you have any idea what that is? Dean didn't answer, and Vogel took that as an invitation. That's a Department of Defense prototype. $400 million of contract. You clean this building. You don't design what's inside it. Here is what Dean Miller did not do. He did not list his credentials. He did not mention Bremerton, or the 11 months, or the patent with somebody else's signature on it. He did not raise his voice. He did not lower his eyes. He had heard some arrangement of that sentence in 3 states and 2 industries, and he'd worked out long ago that the version of himself who answered it never came out ahead. So he looked at Vogel for 2 seconds, then turned back to the glass because the glass was more interesting. Let him finish. Delaney hadn't moved from the end of the monitor bank, arms crossed, head tilted slightly. She was not looking at Dean the way you look at staff. She was looking at him the way you look at a variable. Vogel started to object. She raised one finger about an inch, and he stopped. Dean kept his eyes on the machine. Your fuel pumps run right around 300 hertz. That casing has a mode in the same neighborhood. You're not cracking it. You're ringing it. And you can wrap a foot of steel around a bell, it'll still ring. Vogel said something about resonance being modeled at the design stage, and it came out thinner than he wanted it to. Delaney didn't laugh. She crossed the floor. Her heels clicked on polished concrete. She stopped about 3 feet from him and looked at him properly for the first time. A tall black man in his late 30s, gray uniform, grease in the creases of his knuckles, scuffed boots, 3 days of exhaustion under his eyes. And a completely unbothered stillness she had no idea what to do with. She had walked past this man before. She did the arithmetic later, and it came out around 40 times. How does a custodian know the resonant frequency of an experimental alloy? Spec sheet was on top of the trash I emptied out of his office last night, Dean said, and nodded at Vogel. It was a lie, and it was a good one, and it arrived with no visible effort at all. Delaney stared at him, then at the ruined machine, then at 6 of the most expensively educated people in the Pacific Northwest, all of them examining their own shoes, and something in her snapped. 72 hours without sleep came up out of her as a short, ugly laugh. Perfect. She turned a slow circle with her hands in the air. My propulsion group has 3 doctorates, a wind tunnel, and a 9-figure budget. My custodian has a mop and an opinion. Vogel laughed. 2 of the juniors laughed because he did. One person in that room did not laugh. She looked at the floor. Delaney turned back to Dean, and there was a hard, bright glitter in her eyes that had very little to do with humor. Tell you what, Miller. She'd read the patch. You fix that thing by 8 tomorrow morning, and I'll marry you. Somebody actually whooped. I'm serious, she said, playing to the room now. White dress, church, my father's ring, the whole production. Dean Miller did not smile. He peeled off the first rubber glove and folded it, then the second. and he pushed them both down into his back pocket, the same pocket that held a hospital form worn soft at the creases. The room waited. It didn't know what it was waiting for. He leaned the mop handle against the wall where it wouldn't fall. "I don't need a wife, Ms. Rourke. I need $50,000, cleared into my account by noon tomorrow." The laughing stopped. It stopped the way sound stops when a door shuts. Vogel's face went through 3 expressions and settled on none. Delaney's smile came off like a coat. "50,000. 50. She studied him. "Why 50? "Because that's the number." "That's not an answer." Dean held her eyes. He did not explain, and he did not hand over the thing in his back pocket to make himself sympathetic. And that, more than anything he'd said about Hertz, was what made Delaney Rourke stop and genuinely look at him. "It's the only one you're getting." She had survived 4 board cycles by reading people faster than they could arrange themselves, and what she read here was not arrogance, no performance in it at all. It was weight. The immovable weight of a man standing at the exact end of his options and declining to say so. "If you fail, I fire you that morning, with cause. No severance, no union protection, no reference. You will not push a cart in this city again." Dean nodded slowly, as if she'd quoted him a price on a used car. "If I fail," he said, "then none of what you just listed is worth counting." She tore a sheet of letterhead out of a tray and wrote 3 lines across it in hard, slanted capitals. "If D. Miller stabilizes X7 core full duration by 0800, Rourke Aerospace pays $50,000, immediate wire. If he fails, employment terminated with cause." She signed it, then added a 4th line, his badge number and the words, "Contractor authorization. This date. My authority." She had not run a company for 2 years without learning which piece of paper a board tries to tear up in the morning. She pushed it across the bench. Dean took a cheap ballpoint out of his shirt pocket. He clicked it twice, a small, unglamorous sound in a very quiet room, and signed his name beside hers. "Everybody out!" Vogel started in about security protocols and material handling certifications. "Out, Nolan! All of you! You've had 3 days, you've cost me a chamberliner, and right now you are worth less to me than that ladder." 60 seconds later, the doors sealed, and the floor held 2 people and 1 broken engine. Just under 12 hours. 1 tank of fuel. 1 shot. Delaney Rourke did not go home. She gave the reason once, flatly. She wasn't leaving a man she'd met 40 minutes ago alone with $70 million of federal hardware. "Don't take it personally." "Wasn't going to," Dean said, already walking. She badged the blast door, and the smell hit them both. Scorched metal, ozone, the chemical ghost of spent propellant. Dean walked 1 slow circle around the X7 without touching it. Then he took a screwdriver off his belt, turned it around, and started hitting the casing with the handle. "What are you doing?" "Listening." He hit it near the throat, moved a foot, hit it again. 5 points around the circumference, tilting his head each time, marking the spot in chalk. "You're tapping it," Delaney said, "on a Department of Defense prototype. It's a bell. You want to know what a bell does? You hit it." What came next took 2 hours and looked like nothing. He wouldn't burn anything. 1 full-duration tank left, and he wasn't spending it on a guess. He ran the pumps off the auxiliary feed instead. Mains sealed, 15%, no ignition. Then he taped his phone to the casing. Delaney looked at it, then at him. "That's a phone." "Vibration analyzer. Facilities buys the app, $11. We run it on chiller bearings. You catch one 4 days out if you know the signature." She opened her mouth to mention the $14 million accelerometer array 80 feet away. Then she watched the trace come up on his cracked screen, clean as a heartbeat, and closed it again. He ran it 4 times, writing the numbers on the back of his hand in ballpoint, because he'd walked into a building full of engineers without any paper. Then he sat back on his heels. 297. Cold, At nominal, both pump banks are putting a fundamental into that casing at 297 hertz. He tapped the chalk marks. And that casing has a dozen modes, but the one shaped like this failure, first hoop mode, cold, sits somewhere around 301. Delaney did the arithmetic before he finished. 4 hertz apart. 4 hertz apart, Dean agreed. Which is fine. Cold. He put his hand flat on the black scorch mark, and there was something almost apologetic in it. The way you'd touch a horse that had broken a leg. Alloy gets hot, it loses stiffness. Loses stiffness, its natural frequencies come down. That's a rule of thumb. It isn't true of every material, and I would want a real thermal model before I put it in a report. He looked at her. But on this alloy, in this geometry, it's close enough to bet a night on. Your casing doesn't sit at 301. It walks down, and on the way down, it walks straight through 297. Delaney went very quiet. And when it does, your pumps and your casing agree with each other. Every push lands on the swing. Then it isn't a machine anymore. It's an instrument, and it plays itself apart in about 6 seconds. She pulled the failure logs on her phone. Dean watched her scroll, watched her stop. 18 seconds, 22, 19, 24. That's the crossing, Dean said. That's not coincidence. That's a window. Delaney lowered the phone. Nolan modeled resonance. He modeled it cold. Everybody models it cold. For the next 20 minutes they argued, and it was, although neither would have admitted it, the best 20 minutes either of them had had in a month. She called the marks on the casing cracks. They're not cracks, he said, not unkindly and not slowing down to teach her. Cracks happen once. This is a fatigue front. This is happening 1,000 times a second. She stopped. Not because he'd won, because for the first time in 72 hours, somebody in this building had answered a question of hers with a number instead of a flinch. At 20 past 11, Dean stopped in the middle of a sentence, pulled out his phone, and typed something with his thumbs for about 20 seconds. Then he put it away and picked the wrench back up. Delaney didn't ask. Around midnight, she asked the real question. A spec sheet in a trash can doesn't teach a man to hear 4 hertz. Dean was under the chassis by then, flat on his back, both arms up inside the machine. He didn't stop working. No, it doesn't. I learned it the expensive way. And that was all of it. The ratchet started clicking again, steady as a clock. And Delaney Rourke stood there in a $4,000 suit at midnight, holding a question a man on the floor had just declined to answer. By 1 in the morning, the outer casing was off. He'd stripped it with a speed that was unnerving to watch. No manual, no schematic, just hands that had done this shape of work 10,000 times, moving bolt to bolt in an order that only made sense once you saw it finished. He split a knuckle on a bracket, wiped the blood down his trouser leg without appearing to notice, and kept going. Then he went to the scrap bin in the corner and started digging. That's a bin, Delaney said. It's a supply cabinet with bad manners. What he came out with was a slab of high-density silicone the size of a cutting board. She recognized it. Vogel had specified that stock in the spring and rejected the whole batch. Wrong durometer, insufficient for sustained thermal load. And there was a memo about it somewhere with a lot of confident language in it. Dean turned it over in his hands twice and said it would do. He cut the dampeners with a box cutter, a steel rule, and calipers borrowed out of a drawer. 8 pads, freehand, at 1 in the morning. Ugly, visibly hand-cut. The edges weren't even, and unarguably correct, because a resonance problem is a transmission problem. And if you break the mechanical path between the thing that shakes and the thing that rings, you have solved it, regardless of how the solution photographs. It would never make a brochure. It would never make a patent. It would just work. He seated the first pad into the mount bracket, ran the bolt down to preload, and watched it bottom out. Dean said one quiet word he would not have said in front of his daughter. The pad had crushed nearly twice as far as he'd allowed for. Bottomed out meant metal touching metal straight through the mount. No isolation at all. The last hour had bought him exactly nothing. Delaney watched him back the bolt off and lift the flattened pad out. So you were wrong about the number. He was already running the calipers over the crushed pad, reading the real deflection off it instead of the durometer stamp he'd trusted. Not about the problem. He recut all 8, thicker, off a figure he had now actually measured. It cost him 55 minutes he did not have. And it was the most reassuring thing Delaney Rourke had watched anybody do in 3 days. Because he'd been wrong, out loud, at 2 in the morning, with no audience but her. And then he had simply gone and fixed it. $20, she said when the last pad went home. About that. She stood with her arms crossed, watching a slab of rejected rubber go into a $70 million engine, and found she had absolutely nothing to say about it. Somewhere around 1:30, she said, to nobody in particular, that Redstone flew their own demonstrator in November. Dean grunted from under the machine. The name went past him like weather. Somewhere in the next hour, his phone lit up on the bench. Delaney wasn't reading it. She'd turned to set down a socket, and the screen was simply there, face up, bright in a dark lab. Seattle General, PEDS Cardiology, and under it, the start of a message. Maya's sleeping fine. She looked away fast, faster than she needed to. Dean didn't see any of it. He was elbow deep in the manifold, humming under his breath, entirely somewhere else. And Delaney Rourke stood very still in the middle of her own laboratory and recalculated the whole night. $50,000, cleared by noon. No explanation offered, and none given even when she pushed. And she thought, he didn't tell me. He had a card that would have worked on anybody in this building, and he didn't play it. That was the moment. Not the physics. The restraint. She came back down at 2:10 with 2 paper cups. Dean was on the floor with his back against a pillar, arms trembling faintly the way arms do after 6 hours overhead. Not asleep, just conserving. Black. I assumed you weren't an oat milk man. Rough assumption, Dean said, taking it. Accurate, though. She sat down on the concrete beside him, in the suit. She didn't appear to give it a thought. They drank bad coffee and watched the disassembled engine not do anything. Then she said it. I've known about the lawsuit since 10 o'clock. Dean's cup stopped halfway. I've known about the girl for about 40 minutes. The HVAC, the transformer hum, the faint tick of cooling metal. 8 seconds of it. Dean Miller, Delaney said to the machine rather than to him. Lead propulsion designer. Left the industry 4 years ago. Sued over a variable flow valve patent. Lost. Bankrupt 14 months later. That's the public version. It took my assistant 9 minutes. Dean turned the cup slowly in his hands. The public version has it backwards. They didn't blacklist me. That's the part everybody assumes, and it's the part that lets me off the hook, so I stopped correcting it. He looked at the black scorch mark across the casing. I lost the lawsuit, and then I quit answering the phone. Those are 2 different things. One of them is something they did to me. The other one I did to myself. Delaney did not fill the silence, which was, in its way, the most respectful thing anybody had done for him in 3 years. They took 11 months of work, Dean said eventually. That's fine. People lose work. That happens. He set the cup down on the concrete beside him. What I couldn't get back was the name. That valve is in about 400 airframes. It works, exactly the way I said it would in a conference room in 2019, while 3 men in better suits told me I was wrong. There's just somebody else's signature on the drawing. He said all of it in a flat voice, and the flatness was the worst part, the way an old break is worse than a fresh one. Why custodial? Hourly, no non-compete. Dean almost smiled. And the best union health plan in the state of Washington. He turned the empty cup over in his hands. I stopped building engines the day my daughter's cardiologist used the word defect. She asked who the company was. She asked it lightly. Redstone Dynamics, Dean said. And Delaney Rourke set her coffee down on the concrete. Not fast, and not for effect. She simply stopped drinking and looked straight ahead at nothing. Because in a locked drawer upstairs sat 240 pages on Redstone Dynamics, a competitive file she'd commissioned in February because she had wanted every soft spot they had before the payload bid closed. She had read the litigation index 4 times. She had never once read the name of the complainant. That Tazian long week. And she said nothing else about it that night because she was not the kind of woman who shows you a card while she's still deciding how to play it. But something behind her eyes had started turning over, and it didn't stop. Instead, she told him about her father. He built the first Rourke engine in a garage in Kent. He came in every night smelling like solvent and hot steel. I was 11 before I worked out that wasn't just what men smelled like. He died 4 years ago. I had his job in 11 days. Do you know what the board said? Dean waited. They never once said I was wrong about anything, Delaney said. They said I was decorative. And here she looked over at him, the tired man in the gray uniform with chalk on his hands, and made the comparison that people make. So I do know something about it. Being in a room where they've decided what you are before you open your mouth. Dean Miller did not agree with her. He also didn't argue. He looked at his own hands, and when he spoke, his voice was as level as it had been all night. Maybe. They still let you in the room. Delaney Rourke had been contradicted maybe 4 times in 2 years, and every one of those had come with a bibliography. She sat with it. And what she felt, to her considerable annoyance, was respect. Yes. You know, she said after a while, you're the first man in this building who doesn't look at me like I'm either a paycheck or a photograph. Dean drank the last of his coffee. You're standing between me and a fuel pump, he said. That's all that is? And Delaney Rourke laughed. A real one, surprised out of her, loud in an empty lab at 2:30. She stood and brushed concrete dust off a suit that would never recover. You never even negotiated the marriage clause. Dean got up off the floor in stages, joints popping. It wasn't in the contract. She looked at the letterhead on the bench with 2 signatures on it. No, she said. It wasn't. I need your master credentials, Dean said, picking up the wrench. Vogel locked the injection terminal. She was already walking toward the console. The monitors threw hard blue light up across his face. The first 20 minutes were ugly, raw propulsion timing in a language he hadn't touched in 4 years, backspacing, syntax errors, a compile that failed twice on something embarrassing. Then the old rhythm came back, like riding a bicycle, if the bicycle threw fire out of a titanium nozzle. What he wrote was a stutter. The manual called for the 2 pump banks to fire simultaneously, clean, symmetrical, elegant. Dean staggered them by 1.7 milliseconds. Half a cycle at 297, a deliberate limp built into a machine designed to run smooth. Delaney leaned over the back of the chair to watch the code scroll. You're offsetting primary and secondary. That's an asymmetric thrust vector. Only through the crossing, Dean said, not looking up. Half a cycle apart means the 2 banks never push on the same swing. They fight each other instead of the casing. He scrolled. Then line 240. Chamber temp hits nominal, casing frequency is past 297 and clear, and the code puts them back in sync. She read the block. Actually read it. Followed the conditional. Found the temperature trigger, traced it back to the sensor address. So the whole thing is, survive the first 30 seconds. Dean turned his head and looked at her. That's the whole thing. And what he registered in that second was not that she was beautiful, although she was, and not that she was rich, which was obvious. It was that she had understood the answer. It had been 4 years since anybody understood one of his answers. He hit compile at 6:04 in the morning. Through the high, narrow windows, the Seattle sky had gone a bruised, thin purple. The system accepted the override. Somewhere below them, the building's day shift was starting to arrive. He turned in the chair and looked at her properly for the first time in an hour. If I'm wrong about the crossing, we don't find out slowly. It comes apart on the stand, you lose the packet, and I lose the 50,000. Delaney picked 2 sets of ear defenders off the wall rack and handed him one. If this thing holds, she said, I owe you a wedding. Dean was already watching the telemetry board come alive. You owe me a wire transfer. 6:38 in the morning. Dean took the operator's seat behind 4 inches of blast glass. Delaney stood at his shoulder with both hands on the back of the chair. He ran the checklist from memory, which she noticed. Fuel lines open, chamber evacuated, igniters armed, vibration array live, all 16 channels. Key. She pulled a brass key up from under her collar, her father's worn smooth, and turned it in the console. Authorization accepted. 3, Dean said. 2, 1. He pushed the throttle forward. Through the glass, the world turned into a silent white sun. The sound arrived a half-second later, up through the concrete and into their chests. Not a noise so much as a pressure. Dean didn't look at the fire. He looked at channel 4. 5 seconds. Green. 10. Green. Chamber pressure climbing clean. 15. Delaney let out a breath she'd been holding since 8 o'clock the previous evening. 18 seconds. Channel 4 went yellow. Then channels 6, 9, and 11, all inside a half-second of each other, like dominoes going over. 20. The vibration trace lifted off the baseline and started to climb, and it did not climb gently. 22. It crossed the line where every previous test had aborted. The automatic cutoff threshold flashed, and Dean's thumb moved to the manual inhibit and held it down. 24. Somewhere under all that noise, something in the chamber gave a single hard crack, and the sound came up through the concrete and into the soles of their feet. What? Miller! Delaney's hand was on the abort, flat on it, not pressing. Don't. It's past Nolan's line. It is 15% past his line. Her thumb moved a quarter of an inch. Don't. He never once looked at her. His eyes stayed locked on a single trace on a single screen, and the only part of him that moved was the thumb holding the inhibit down. 26 seconds. The trace kept climbing. 27. Higher. And somewhere in there, with the numbers going the wrong way and the building shaking and a woman's hand resting on an abort switch, Dean Miller had exactly one clear thought. And the thought was, 400 meters under the Pacific, 11 months, confetti, 29, 30, 31. The trace fell off a cliff, not tapered, not eased, red spiked to flat green line in 0.4 of a second. And it stayed there. The casing had walked down through 297 hertz and out the other side. On line 240, the code found its temperature trigger and slid the pump banks back into sync. And 8 hand-cut pads of rejected silicone ate what was left. And the sound changed. The flat, hard hum went out of it. What replaced it was round and enormous and continuous, the noise a thing makes when it stops fighting itself. Thrust crossed 100% of rated, 102, 103, 104, and held. 45 seconds, 50, full duration. Chamber pressure nominal, Dean said, and his voice came out perfectly level, which took an effort nobody would ever know about. Vibrations inside limits on all 16 channels. It's stable. Delaney Rourke ripped off her ear defenders. She didn't look at the fire or the numbers or him. She reached past his shoulder and shut down the bank of red warning strobes one switch at a time. And her hand was shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the last one. Dean pulled the throttle back. The fire died all at once. No fade, just gone, and the chamber filled with smoke, and the titanium ticked as it cooled. The loudest thing in that room was the silence that came after it. At 7:30, the doors hissed open, and Nolan Vogel walked in with a briefcase and the face of a man arriving at his own funeral. He got 4 steps. Then he stopped, because the X7 was still on the stand, in one piece, one flank of the titanium glowing a dull cherry red, and the whole chamber stank of a completed full-duration burn. His briefcase hit the floor. Delaney came out of the booth buttoning her jacket, and she looked like she'd slept 9 hours in a spa. 104% of rated thrust, full duration, no abort. Vogel's mouth opened. Harmonic resonance, she said. The casing frequency walks down through the pump fundamental at 18 seconds. Every time, Nolan. It's in your own logs. Fixed with $20 of the silicone you threw away and a half-cycle offset in the injection phasing. Vogel's eyes went to the man by the service elevator, then back to her, and landed on the only thing he had left. He touched the prototype. There are handling certifications, I authorized it at 8 o'clock last night, in writing, with his badge number on it. She didn't raise her voice. Anything else? There wasn't. Dean was over by the service elevator packing a battered red toolbox, because that was where he'd left it, and nobody had told him the night was over. Delaney crossed the floor to him. Miller, I said I'd marry you. Dean clicked a toolbox latches shut. You said a lot of things at 8 o'clock last night. I only wrote one of them down. And his phone went off in his pocket. He pulled it out on reflex the way you do. Rourke Aerospace. Incoming wire. $50,000 and 0 cents. Cleared. And whatever Delaney Rourke had been about to say next fell out of that room like it had never been said at all. He didn't shout. He didn't punch the air. Dean Miller sat down on the metal step of the test stand, put his elbows on his knees, and bent his head over the phone, and let out a breath he'd been holding since February. Then he did exactly one thing. He called the hospital. He asked for billing. He spelled his daughter's surname twice. He read the account number off the soft, creased form without looking at it, and asked the woman on the other end to confirm the funds were logged against the noon cutoff. And then, because he did not entirely believe in good news, he asked her to say it again. $50,000 did not make Dean Miller rich. No house, no car, not one day off. After the surgeon and the anesthesia and the theater time, about $900 left of it. What it bought was a slot on a calendar. 6 o'clock the day after tomorrow. That was all he had ever asked it to do. 20 feet away, Delaney Rourke watched all of it, and nobody watched her watching. She saw a man she had publicly humiliated 11 hours earlier sit down on a step and go quiet. She saw him spell a child's name and ask a stranger to repeat it. And at no point did he look up to see whether she was impressed. That was the moment. Not the flat green line. That. He got to Seattle General after 9. Maya was asleep. Dean sat down in the cracked vinyl chair, took the paperback out of his jacket, and read a sleeping 9-year-old the whole chapter about the mountain and the dark underneath it. Every word. No skipping. She didn't hear a line of it. That wasn't the point. At 4 that afternoon, Harlan Stroud arrived at the board meeting with a drafted resolution in his briefcase and left it there. The Department of Defense confirmation had landed at 11. 7 people sat around a mahogany table above Puget Sound, arranging their faces into something like relief. Well, Stroud said, Vogel's team came through. Vogel is gone. I signed it at 9 this morning. Somebody's pen stopped. When? She put a file on the table and pushed it into the middle. Dean Miller. Until 4 years ago, lead propulsion designer at Redstone Dynamics. His variable flow valve is in 400 airframes. It is not in his name because Redstone paid a patent examiner to backdate a filing in 2019. Stroud said something about that being an extraordinary allegation. Page 190 of the competitive file Kelleher has been building since February, Delaney said. Commissioned because Redstone is bidding against us for the NASA payload. I have read those pages 4 times. I never once read the name of the man who filed the complaint. She let that sit. Last night he found a failure in 90 minutes that this company missed for 3 months, with a screwdriver and an $11 app. Because you don't design around the flaw, you design with it. And we have run this company on simulations for 4 years, which is exactly why we nearly lost the stand at 2 this morning. I'm standing up a new division, Advanced Experimental Systems. Miller runs it, reports to me, and legal goes after Redstone on the patent, which invalidates the technology they're bidding NASA with. Stroud put both palms flat on the table, which was what he did instead of shouting. You cannot hand an executive engineering role to a janitor. The optics alone. The optics, Delaney said very quietly, are that 6 of your engineers stood in a hallway while a man whose name you won't say saved $400 million of your money. She smiled at him without any warmth whatsoever. Fight me on that and I'll say the sentence into a microphone. Stroud didn't fight her on the optics. He was smarter than that, which was why he had 3 votes. Then let's talk about the part you're skipping. He turned a page he had clearly already read. Miller settled with Redstone in 2019. Settlements carry non-assertion clauses. So we hire the plaintiff, then sue on the same patent. And Redstone's first motion isn't about the patent at all. It's that Rourke Aerospace went out and purchased a lawsuit. That's tortious interference. That's a countersuit that outlives the payload contract, and it lands on our balance sheet, not yours. 2 board members found something interesting about their hands. It is, Delaney agreed. Unless the settlement was procured by fraud. She let that sit long enough for somebody to do the arithmetic. A settlement signed on a filing date bought from a federal examiner isn't a settlement. It's a receipt. And the first thing our complaint does is ask a judge to say so. Stroud took about 20 seconds. Then he named his price. Provisional, 6 months. The division is ring-fenced. Separate books, separate liability, and it doesn't touch the DoD program. He still wasn't looking up. And if the patent action gets dismissed on the pleadings, you resign the chair. Somebody started to object on her behalf. Delaney raised a hand. She did not think about it for anywhere near as long as she should have. Done. She had just bet her father's seat on a man she'd known 31 hours, and she signed the minutes without reading them twice. One thing, she said at the door, none of it exists without his signature, and he doesn't want it. I have until morning. The hospital cafeteria at 2 in the morning was a purgatory of humming lights and vending machines. Maya went into theater at 6. Dean sat at a laminate table with a styrofoam cup he wasn't drinking, cycling through recovery statistics he'd already memorized. Then heels on linoleum. Delaney Rourke in a black trench coat, out of place as a shark in a municipal pool, carrying a thermos and 2 folders. Guatemalan, she said, setting it down. It beats whatever that is. You didn't have to come. Deal's closed. She sat down anyway. The first folder was a contract. Director, Advanced Experimental Systems. The salary line was a number he had to read twice. No, Dean said. Redstone didn't just take a patent off me. They took the part of me that believed being right was enough, and it took 3 years to stop expecting it back. I'm not putting my daughter's father in front of that company again. She opened the second folder without arguing with him. A litigation brief, a chain of wire records, a name and a date in October of 2019. And underneath it, a patent drawing. His drawing. The line work he'd done at a kitchen table in Renton. The correction he'd made to the seat angle at 2 in the morning because he couldn't sleep. With somebody else's signature at the bottom. Dean Miller looked at that page for a long time. I'm not offering you a job as a favor, Delaney said. I'm offering you a war because I need to win it. You want your name back. I want the payload contract and my father's company still standing in 5 years. That isn't 2 fights, Dean. It's 1. And I need a signature by morning. He took the cheap ballpoint out of his shirt pocket, the same one that had signed a piece of letterhead 30 hours earlier. He clicked it twice. He signed the contract, then the authorization, and slid both back across the table. Take the month, Delaney said. Paid. When she's walking, 50th floor. She stood and put the folders under her arm. And then she didn't leave. Miller. I made a promise in front of 6 witnesses. Dean didn't look up from the table. You made a joke in front of 6 witnesses. The vending machine hummed and cycled and went quiet. I stopped joking somewhere around 2 in the morning. She took something out of her coat pocket and set it on the laminate between them. A man's wedding ring, old gold worn thin on one side, scratched to hell. Her father's. The man who came in every night smelling like solvent and hot steel. She did not push it toward him. "Not today," Delaney said. "You've got a daughter going into theater in 4 hours, grease under your fingernails, and no earthly idea who you are yet." She picked the ring back up and closed her hand around it. "When you're ready, it'll still be in this pocket. I'm not asking you to answer tonight." Then she walked out, and her heels went down the corridor and got quiet. Dean sat there a long time afterward, looking at the bare patch of laminate where it had been. He had signed 2 contracts in 30 hours. The one that frightened him wasn't on paper. At 11 minutes past 9 the next morning, the theater doors opened and Dr. Eric Halverson pulled his mask down and gave Dean Miller a single nod. Clean closure. No complications. Sitting up by dinner. Dean stood up too fast and had to put a hand flat against the wall. And 19 miles south, in a glass tower in Renton, a man sat down across a desk at Redstone Dynamics with a Rourke badge still in his jacket pocket. Nolan Vogel had been unemployed for 26 hours and had spent all of them making calls. He said a name. The man behind the desk, the man who signed a settlement 4 years ago and never once thought about it since, put his coffee down very slowly. "Say it again." Vogel said it again. The man opened a drawer, took out a case file with 4 years of dust along the top edge, and set it down without opening it. Find out what he still remembered. Dean Miller got his daughter back that morning. In 6 weeks, he'd step onto the 50th floor in a suit that didn't fit yet, past people who'd stepped around his cart for 3 years, and there would be a door with his name on it. And the company that erased that name would already be waiting. So, is she actually going to marry him? And when Redstone comes, will Delaney Rourke still be standing next to him? Tell me in the comments. And if you want the rest of it, subscribe. Part 2 is already on the way.